Okay, I also have a few pictures to show you, so let me start right in. You will notice that these cover some familiar themes. We are basically all looking at the same material, but let me show you this particular picture, which I find helpful in understanding the great global imbalance that we have been experiencing in recent years. So this shows the current account deficits and the current account surpluses. And you will see if the data were perfect, these lines would be of equal length above and below, but in fact the data are imperfect, but nevertheless I think the picture is reasonably clear. We have the United States, which is the red bars, in deficit, in growing deficits, for a very long time. I call your attention to how long the United States has been running current account deficits. It goes back 20 years at least, maybe 25. China's part in this is actually quite small. So if you look at the China bar, which is the dark green bar at the top on the right, you will see that only in the last 5 years has China been an important part of the balancing surplus. Many other countries of the world have played that role over the longer period of time. So the Middle East, Germany, Japan, other European Union countries, and so forth have been playing that role of the counterbalancing export surplus. So I think it's not really China's fault. If anybody wants to debate that subject, I think the United States has been in this game much longer and to a much greater extent than has China. So let me just start with that. Although that imbalance is unsustainable. You know, this is an imbalance. We have debated this in the faculty at Columbia. It is unsustainable. And that which is unsustainable tends to end. And I think the crisis is nature's way of bringing this imbalance under control. Now, this is one of my pictures of why we are having the kind of crisis we are at this point. And my simple point here is that the reason for the crisis is that the United States has enjoyed incredible prosperity over the last 25 years, but this has been a debt-driven prosperity. The reason we have had as much prosperity as we have is because our banks have been increasingly willing to lend money to consumers. And when this happens, debt of the consumers grows faster than the income of consumers. And that has been what has powered our economy. That's been what's powered China's economy in part in more recent years. We have been allowing consumers to borrow well beyond their means. And you can see here a picture that is really quite alarming. You see that at this point, by 2008, household debt to GDP has reached 100%. We have $14 trillion of consumer debt in the United States. About 80% of that is mortgage debt. And that is about equal to our GDP. The last time that the ratio of GDP, of household debt to GDP was that high was, guess what? The early 1930s. And look what happened then. So I think this is, to me, a sort of galvanizing picture to help see the magnitude of what has been going on in the United States, the extent to which our prosperity has been driven by debt. If you say, what's the right level of debt to GDP, maybe it's that area in the middle where the lines kind of balance out somewhere between 40 and 60%. That's probably an okay level, but you can see that in about the early 1980s, we broke out of that equilibrium and started rising through the different percentages. By the time we hit 2000, it's gotten up to 70% of GDP, and just in the last 7 years, say from 2000 to 2007, it shot all the way from 70 to 100% of GDP, and that is where subprime came in, and that's what gets us into the problem we have. So I really believe that that is the centerpiece of the crisis. By the way, there's similar patterns in Europe. The United States is not alone in this. Let's turn to China. Here is a conventional breakdown of the composition of China's GDP into government consumption, household consumption, investment, and net exports. So I will make the same point that Dr. Wang just has with more detailed slides. Net exports play a small role. Okay, look how small net exports are in the overall picture. You can see that it is the red bar of consumption that has grown somewhat, but as a percentage of the total has actually shrunk from about 50% to about 35%. The big force in China's GDP is investment. And look how rapidly that orange bar of investment has been growing. China's growth has been a story of investment and continues to be a story of investment. I believe that that investment has been, guess what, powered by debt. It is debt that has powered the investment. Just as debt has powered the consumption consumer debt in the United States, so debt has powered China's investment boom, and it's a mirror image. It's the same story seen from the other side. Okay, let me show you that in a little more detail. So in this graph, what I've done is taken in just gross renminbi terms the increment each year to domestic credit and the increment each year to GDP. And I think this picture is very, very striking. In many years, you'll see that those blue bars, the increment to credit, is actually larger than the increment to GDP. What is happening is the growth in GDP is real, but it has been powered by an even larger growth in credit. And that pattern has been going on for some time. This is a pattern that in China extends way back into the 1990s. So in the 1990s, many Asian banks all over East Asia, banks were overlending and companies were overproducing. That was a pattern in Thailand, it was a pattern in Korea, it was a pattern in Indonesia, and it was also a pattern in China. Now, the other countries got pulled up short in the East Asia crisis of 1997-98. That crisis, in my view, was a large international run on the banks. The banks in Indonesia, in Korea, and in Thailand, and in other countries had been financed by the international banking system. And they had been financed with very short-term debt from the international banks. When it became apparent that too much of East Asian growth was being driven by debt, the international banks cut off the funding. There was a run on the East Asian banks by the international banks, and that brought them up short. That basically created in East Asia the kind of crisis we've recently seen in the United States and Europe. Now, China did not believe that it was part of the East Asia crisis. China, I think, congratulated itself that it was not part of the crisis because it did not have a run on its banks. Well, of course it did not have a run on its banks. Its banks are owned by the state, guaranteed by the state. No depositor would have tried to pull their money out of the Chinese banks. So they did not have that kind of funding signal that says stop. On the other hand, I think that the fact that that was true, so that China did not have that kind of a crisis, does not mean that they didn't have a problem. So it's a little bit like this. I think it's like a pain signal. So we have in our bodies pain signals. If we put our hand on a stove, we get a pain signal that is very unpleasant, but tells us, stop, get your hand off that stove. Now, I think the shock to a financial system is like a pain signal. It says, stop, your lending is bad, your lending is destroying value. And if you cut off the pain signal, well, maybe you just go on burning your hand. I think there's a risk of that. So what I see in China is an excessive growth in credit, which then gave rise to non-performing loans. So there was a very large buildup of non-performing loans in China, as there was also in Korea and Thailand and elsewhere. The NPLs did not get recognized in China. That is, they did not get admitted, brought into the public view until the year 2000. So in the year 2000, the red line jumps up, not because that's when the NPLs were created. They were created all through the 1990s. So this red line really should be extending to the left in a horizontal way from the peak point. But instead, they were not admitted until 2000. Then, when they were admitted, China, after the passing of the East Asia crisis, said, right, we do have a problem, and in our own gradualist way, we're going to try and fix it. And so these NPLs, non-performing loans, were taken off the books of the Chinese banks. There were 4 asset management companies formed, and each one of them was associated, there was an asset management company for each of the 4 large banks, and they absorbed the non-performing loans so that this red line could come back down again. But now if you remember back to the previous slide, here is the growth in new credit. Look what happened in 2000 and 2003. In 2002 and 2003, look at the magnitude of the blue bars in those years. That was an enormous burst of credit that gave rise to yet more non-performing loans. Those non-performing loans, however, parked only briefly in the banks and slid right through to the asset management companies, so that what happened to the asset management companies was this. The asset management companies had cumulative non-performing loans that suddenly reached very, very high levels in 2004 and 2005. Furthermore, most of those non-performing loans were lost. Okay, so in 2004, cumulative losses had reached 4.4 trillion renminbi, and in 2005, 5.3 trillion. The losses were about 75 to 80% of the total amount of non-performing loans. Now, we reach the present time, and what is happening? China has responded to the crisis with a huge increase in new lending. So here is a picture of the new lending, and this is my last picture. New loans in China have just taken an enormous jump in the first quarter of 2009. Look at the magnitude of that jump. In the first quarter of 2009, 4.5 trillion renminbi were lent by the banks. That is equal to 70% not of the incremental GDP, but of the whole GDP in the first quarter. So this was a massive increase, and has been mentioned by the earlier speakers, that increase did not go to consumers, it went to producers. I believe it is very clear that this is another generation of non-performing loans coming. Think about that. If part of the GDP growth is based on a loss in the banks, part of the growth is not real. Part of the growth is taken away, has to be paid back later by the government. It's as if you look like you're growing, but part of the growth is based on an illusion. It's based on loans that have losses. And so I think that this is the problem in China, and I worry that there is not enough pressure on getting that kind of value-destroying lending stopped. And I really think China will be far better off if it can reorient its lending away from particularly the state-owned enterprises who are inefficient users of capital. To stimulate production, why not stimulate more in the township and village enterprises? Go into the rural part of the country where I think there are many enterprises that could use the capital more efficiently, and try not to be destroying value with the new lending, which I fear is what's happening right now. Okay, thanks very much.